Imagine a world almost erased, a world where nearly all of humanity vanished 900,000 years ago. The Earth was plunged into a relentless ice age, forests shriveled, animals fled, and small bands of humans clung to survival by the narrowest of margins. From tens of thousands, only about 1,300 individuals endured, scattered in isolated pockets, their fate teetering on a knife edge. Modern genetics reveals this near extinction, hidden in the very code of our DNA, showing how our ancestors' survival shaped the human story in ways we are only beginning to understand. This is not just a tale of endurance, it is a chronicle of luck, adaptability, and the fragile miracle that allowed life to continue. In this journey through deep time, we will step into the firelight of the past, witness the struggles of the few who persisted, and uncover the echoes of their existence that still pulse through our veins today, reminding us how extraordinary survival really is. Sorry for the interruption, where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. 900,000 years ago, the human story came dangerously close to ending before it had even begun. It is hard to imagine now, with billions of us spread across every continent, our cities glowing through the night, and our voices filling the world. But there was a time when all of humanity could have fit into a single small village. Fewer than 1,300 individuals remained. Not 1,300 in one place, not a single community, but scattered across the vast wilderness of Africa and Eurasia, separated by mountains, rivers, deserts, and silence. A fragile thread of existence stretched so thin, it might have snapped with the slightest misstep. Scientists call this moment a genetic bottleneck, a time when the diversity of our species collapsed almost overnight in evolutionary terms. We know this not from ancient texts, for no writing existed, nor from myths passed down, for language itself may still have been in its infancy. Instead, the story hides in our blood, in the quiet codes of DNA. Modern geneticists discovered it like archaeologists uncovering bones. In the patterns of mutations, in the repetition of base pairs, a hidden signal emerged. It told us that nearly every human alive today descends from that small remnant of survivors. But the numbers are staggering to consider. Imagine a world where 99% of humanity vanished, entire lineages gone forever, families erased without memory, cultures that never had the chance to blossom. We cannot know their names, we cannot see their faces, but their absence surrounds us. Every gap in our genetic record, every lost possibility, echoes with their silence. It is a silence that might have consumed everything. For this was not simply a dip in numbers. It was an extinction event unfolding in slow motion. When populations fall so low, survival itself becomes a gamble. Disease can wipe out a group overnight. A storm can drown an entire lineage. A drought can silence the last voices in a valley. For those few who endured, every day was a negotiation with death. The odds were against them, yet somehow they persisted, carrying the fire of humanity through the darkness. What drove this collapse? What force pushed us to the very edge of oblivion? The Earth itself was shifting. The climate grew harsher, the ice thicker, the rains less predictable. Food grew scarce. But in that fragile moment, when survival teetered on a knife's edge, a miracle occurred. Humanity did not vanish. We endured. And from that tiny remnant, from fewer than 1,300 souls, the entire future of our species would unfold. The mystery of humanity's near extinction lay buried for almost 1,000,000 years, hidden not in stone tools or scattered bones, but in the invisible threads of our very being. It was only in recent decades that scientists began to uncover it, using a tool no ancient ancestor could have imagined. DNA became our time machine. Within the spiral of molecules carried in every cell, the entire history of humanity is written. It does not tell its story in words or symbols, but in the shifting patterns of genetic variation, in the places where the code repeats, falters, or disappears entirely. When researchers first began sequencing human genomes, they expected to find a vast tapestry of diversity, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. What they found instead was a striking emptiness, a narrowing of possibility. The signal was subtle but unmistakable. Across all modern humans, certain genetic markers suggested that at one point in the distant past, our numbers had collapsed catastrophically. Where there should have been thousands of unique variations, there were only a handful. Entire branches of the human family tree had been pruned away. This revelation came not from a single study but from decades of careful work. By comparing the DNA of people across the world, from Africa to Asia to Europe, geneticists noticed the same fingerprints of loss repeating again and again. A bottleneck. A moment when the human population shrank so dramatically that only a tiny fraction of our ancestors passed on their genes. All others vanished without a trace, their existence remembered only by the absence they left behind. To grasp the scale of this discovery, imagine DNA as a great library of human history. For millions of years, every birth adds new pages, every life contributes fresh lines to the text. But 900,000 years ago, almost the entire library burned. What remains is a fragment, a few surviving books carried through the fire. Every one of us alive today descends from those salvaged pages. The lost volumes are gone forever, unwritten stories, unimagined futures. What is most remarkable is that our bodies still carry the shadow of this catastrophe. The narrowness of our genetic diversity compared to other species is a constant reminder of how close we came to erasure. Elephants, chimpanzees, even some species of birds hold more genetic variety than humans. That is how severe the bottleneck was. It reduced us to almost nothing, and the echo of that collapse still shapes who we are. The genome does not lie. It whispers across time, telling us that most of our ancestors disappeared into silence, leaving only a fragile few to carry humanity forward. Before the collapse, the human world was a patchwork of scattered bands spread thinly across Africa and parts of Eurasia. There were no great cities, no villages, not even permanent camps. Life was movement, constant and necessary. Groups rarely numbered more than a few dozen, bound by kinship and survival, carrying only what they could on their backs or in their hands. They lived as hunters and gatherers, as every ancestor had before them, walking the land in search of what it could offer that season. The landscape itself was different from the one we know. Vast grasslands rolled across parts of Africa, filled with herds of antelope and wild cattle. Forests sheltered fruit, nuts, and roots. Rivers provided fish and waterfowl. To live meant to follow these shifting resources, to know the migration of animals and the ripening of plants, to remember where waterholes formed after rain and which caves offered shelter from storms. For early humans, survival depended on memory, intuition, and cooperation. The days were not easy, but they were balanced. Hunting required patience and coordination. Men and women together tracked prey, reading faint marks on the ground, listening for distant rustles in the tall grass. A successful hunt meant meat shared among all, bones cracked open for marrow, skins used for warmth. When hunting failed, they turned to plants. Women gathered roots and tubers, children learned to recognize edible berries from poisonous ones, and elders passed down knowledge of where to find honey hidden in trees or shellfish along the shore. Every member of the group contributed, for life left no room for idleness. And yet there was richness in this existence. Nights brought firelight, stories spoken in simple tongues, gestures, and laughter. Bonds were strong, for isolation meant death. A child was everyone's child. A wound was everyone's burden. These small societies moved lightly over the land, leaving little behind but footprints and ash. The world provided, and they took what they needed, then moved on before the earth could exhaust itself. Neanderthals too lived in this rhythm, though adapted to colder climates farther north. Their bodies were stockier, their muscles denser, their tools finely crafted for a life among ice and stone. They hunted large game such as mammoths and bison, thriving in environments that would have crushed other species. Though different in form, they shared the same fragile balance with nature, never ruling over it, only negotiating with it. This was the world before the collapse, a world of freedom and uncertainty, of small groups bound to the land and the seasons. They could not know that their way of life, fragile though it was, would soon face a trial so severe that almost all of them would vanish from the earth. The world 900,000 years ago was entering one of its most unforgiving chapters. For countless generations, early humans had adapted to rhythms of warming and cooling, to cycles of ice that came and went in predictable spans. But then, something changed. The planet shifted into a new and harsher pattern, a period scientists now call the mid-Pleistocene transition. Ice ages grew longer, winters stretched deeper, and summers grew weaker. The balance of the Earth's climate tilted, and with it, the fragile existence of humanity. Glaciers expanded far across the northern continents, swallowing valleys and grinding mountains down to bare stone. Forests that had once provided fruits, nuts, and shelter vanished beneath endless stretches of cold steppe and tundra. Rivers shifted courses, lakes dried into cracked basins, and rains grew unreliable. Where herds of animals once roamed, the land became barren, leaving only the hardiest species behind. For humans who lived by following game and gathering plants, the change was catastrophic. Food that had sustained generations suddenly disappeared. The roots dried up in the soil, the fruits ripened less often. Herds of antelope, bison, and mammoth moved farther and farther in search of their own survival, and hunting them became riskier, more exhausting, and often fruitless. Small bands of humans were forced to travel longer distances, crossing hostile terrain in search of what little nourishment remained. With each journey, the chance of finding enough to feed an entire group diminished. Hunger grew into the constant companion of life. The cold itself was an enemy. Nights stretched longer, winds cut deeper, and the simplest injuries or illnesses became lethal in freezing conditions. Fire was salvation, but wood grew scarce in many places, leaving people exposed to the bitter chill. Even the Neanderthals, built with thick bodies and strong muscles to withstand the cold, struggled against the advancing ice. For early humans in Africa, the problem was not ice but drought. Rainfall faltered, rivers shrank, and once fertile lands became stretches of dust and rock. In this shifting environment, survival was no longer a matter of skill alone. It became a lottery dictated by forces beyond human control. A band might endure for a few seasons, only to vanish the next when food failed or water disappeared. Entire lineages were erased silently, leaving no trace except in the silence of the genetic record. The mid-Pleistocene transition was relentless. It was not one storm, not one famine, but a grinding and drawn-out trial that lasted tens of thousands of years. Generation after generation faced a world growing colder, harsher, and less forgiving. It was this force of nature, vast and impersonal, that pushed humanity to the edge of extinction, setting the stage for the bottleneck that nearly ended our story. The land itself began to betray the people who depended on it. What had once been a mosaic of forests, grasslands, and rivers slowly unraveled into something colder and emptier. The climate shift stripped away abundance piece by piece. Forests retreated under the weight of advancing ice and spreading drought, their canopies thinning until only scattered groves remained. Where trees once bore fruit and nuts, now bare branches reached into empty skies. The roots and tubers buried beneath the soil, a reliable food in harder times, grew smaller and scarcer, leaving gatherers with baskets half empty. Grasslands that had once supported vast herds withered into dry plains or froze beneath permafrost. Antelope, wild cattle, and mammoth no longer followed predictable paths across the land. Their migrations became erratic, stretched over greater distances, and often led them far beyond the reach of hungry hunters. People would wake to find the valleys that once echoed with hoofbeats eerily silent. A single animal, if caught, could sustain a group for weeks, but more often the hunters returned with nothing. This scarcity reshaped every moment of human life. Days were consumed by searching, tracking, wandering farther from familiar shelters in hopes of stumbling upon something edible. The energy spent was often greater than what could be gained, a cruel trade that left bodies lean and spirits weary. Some bands followed the herds across unforgiving terrain, only to collapse from exhaustion, or find themselves in lands where no food grew at all. Others stayed behind in shrinking pockets of abundance, trying to survive on dwindling resources until those too gave out. Predators fared no better. Lions, saber-toothed cats, and hyenas, once thriving on the herds, now prowled the same barren landscapes, more desperate and dangerous than ever. Competition grew fierce. Humans scavenged what predators left behind, fighting off rivals both animal and human for scraps of meat. At times, survival meant stealing from the jaws of other hunters, a dangerous gamble that could cost a life as easily as win a meal. The scarcity did not just shape the stomach, it shaped the mind. Hunger made tempers shorter, trust more fragile. A broken tool or a failed hunt could spark despair, for there was no guarantee of tomorrow's meal. Groups may have splintered, some seeking new lands, others clinging stubbornly to the old. Yet no direction promised certainty. The earth itself seemed to turn against them, stripping away the security that once allowed small bands to flourish. The landscapes that had nurtured humanity became wastelands of struggle. Every step forward was shadowed by the question of survival, every horizon filled with uncertainty. The world had narrowed to a single pursuit: to find enough food to see another sunrise. Nights during the collapse were long and heavy, filled with the kind of silence that carried more fear than peace. Small groups of humans huddled close to one another, their only comfort the fragile glow of firelight flickering against stone and dirt. Fire was more than warmth. It was protection, a fragile circle of safety, carved into a world that seemed intent on swallowing them whole. The flames pushed back the darkness, but just beyond the reach of the light, shadows moved. Eyes reflected back from the wild. Predators stalked the edges, waiting for a moment of weakness, testing the courage of the fragile bands who dared to exist in their domain. Each day was a gamble between hunger and danger. Hunting was no longer a matter of choice but necessity, and yet success was rare. When no game could be found, groups scavenged the remains left by lions, hyenas, or saber-toothed cats. This too was perilous, for the beasts that claimed the kill often lingered nearby, ready to defend it. Sometimes survival meant throwing stones and shouting into the night, chasing predators from bones already picked nearly clean. Marrow cracked from those bones became a feast, a treasure measured not in abundance, but in the faint chance of keeping breath in fragile bodies. Life at the fire's edge was desperate and thin. Children cried from empty bellies, and the old grew weaker, falling behind as groups moved in search of food and water. Even the healthy were shadows of themselves, their ribs visible beneath skin stretched by hunger, their movements slowed by exhaustion. Each dawn was not welcomed with joy, but with the relentless question of how much longer they could endure. Trust and cooperation became the glue that held these bands together, yet they were fragile bonds. A spark of conflict over scraps could tear a group apart, scattering them into smaller numbers that were even more vulnerable. Loneliness in such a world was almost always a death sentence. To live meant to cling together, to share every bite, every ember of warmth, every moment of watchfulness against the predators that circled in the night. Yet within this hardship, fire carried a quiet hope. Around the flames, stories were told in gestures and broken words. Eyes followed the sparks rising into the night, as though imagining spirits beyond the darkness. In those moments, humanity held on to something more than survival. They carried memory, connection, and a flicker of determination. The world around them was hostile, but the fire reminded them that they were not entirely powerless. Even in the grip of fear, they could endure, if only for another night. The scale of the collapse is difficult to comprehend. For hundreds of thousands of years, early humans had managed to endure in scattered bands across Africa and beyond. Their numbers were never immense compared to the great herds of animals or the swarming flocks of birds, but they were steady. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children moved through grasslands, forests, and coasts, surviving in the balance between hunger and abundance. It was not a world of plenty, but it was a world in which humanity could persist. Then came the shift. The ice grew thicker. The rains faltered, and the earth's bounty withered. Populations began to shrink. At first, it might have been gradual, so slow that no one living could sense the enormity of what was happening. A band failed here, another disappeared there, famine wiping away entire lineages. Over generations, the decline deepened. What began as tens of thousands dwindled to thousands, and then to mere hundreds in scattered pockets of survival. By the time the bottleneck was fully formed, the numbers had collapsed to something almost unimaginable. Fewer than 1,300 humans remained alive on the entire planet. Science gives us this revelation, not through stories passed down or carvings on stone, but through the study of DNA. Within our genes lies a record of ancestry, a measure of how many individuals once carried unique variations of life. When researchers studied the genomes of modern humans, they found evidence of a sharp reduction in genetic diversity. It was as if the tree of humanity, once spread with countless branches, had been hacked nearly to the trunk. The number left, about 1,280, is not an estimate plucked from imagination but a calculation written in the patterns of the code that shapes our bodies. To imagine this number is to realize how close humanity came to erasure. A few more deaths, a few more failed seasons, and there might have been nothing left. A single disease could have swept through and ended us. A catastrophic storm could have drowned an entire community. At such a low point, the margin between survival and extinction was so thin that it is astonishing the line held at all. Every human alive today descends from that fragile remnant. The billions of lives across the earth trace their lineage back to fewer than 1,300 individuals who endured when almost all others vanished. It was a cliff edge in our history, one that nearly cut the human story short before it could ever unfold. The world of 900,000 years ago became a place defined not only by scarcity but by silence. Where once the land had thrummed with life, the rustle of leaves, the cries of animals, the chatter of humans moving in small bands, now a strange emptiness settled over the earth. Valleys that had once echoed with the sound of herds moving through tall grasses were still. Rivers trickled, but even their murmur seemed weaker, as if the land itself had grown hushed. Caves that had been home to families now lay empty, the walls bare of footprints and echoes. The human voice, once a constant presence in these ancient landscapes, grew rare, a fleeting sound among the wind and the occasional predator's call. It was a silence heavier than absence, a quiet that pressed on the senses. With fewer humans alive, fewer fires burning, fewer steps on the earth, the world became a stage of anticipation. Every sound that did break through the quiet, the snap of a branch underfoot, the distant roar of a predator, the flapping wings of a startled bird carried a weight it had never held before. Small groups moved cautiously, alert to the faintest rustle, every footfall calculated to avoid drawing attention. The emptiness magnified danger. Silence itself became an adversary, for it allowed the shadows of hunger, frost, and predators to loom larger than ever. Caves, once bustling with daily life, now felt like monuments to absence. The walls that had been scratched with early markings or etched with memories of firelight became ghostly spaces. The hearths were cold, the stones scattered as if abandoned in haste, and the scent of smoke faded into the damp air. In the forests and grasslands, human tracks were quickly erased by wind and rain, leaving no trace of the tiny bands that struggled to survive. It was a world in which existence was nearly invisible, a world where being seen could mean death, and where the faintest sound could carry consequences. Predators thrived in this quiet, moving through the abandoned spaces with ease. Lions, wolves, saber-toothed cats, and hyenas roamed lands that had once been shared with humans. The absence of the steady rhythm of human life made the balance of the ecosystem shift. Nature continued, but in a way that underscored the fragility of the few humans who remained. Even the simplest tasks, gathering roots or hunting small game, were shadowed by a tense awareness that silence could conceal both opportunity and peril. This silent world framed the collapse of humanity as a visible absence, a void marked by survival alone. Every sound, every movement, every cautious breath mattered. Life became a negotiation with emptiness, a constant listening, a ceaseless waiting. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath, and the surviving humans were forced to do the same, existing in the eerie hush of a world nearly abandoned by their kind. As the collapse deepened, the few humans who survived were no longer part of a connected world. Bands that had once roamed vast territories in seasonal cycles now found themselves trapped in isolation, scattered across barren landscapes. Valleys once filled with distant fires and the faint echoes of human voices became islands of silence. Travel between groups was dangerous, sometimes impossible. Rivers had shifted, forests had vanished, and ice or drought carved barriers that could not be crossed. The survivors were forced to live in small, fragmented populations, often numbering only a handful of individuals, clinging to life in solitary pockets. Isolation brought with it a strange and heavy weight. Each group became an entire world unto itself. Knowledge that had been passed from one band to another, stories of hunting grounds, migration routes, or edible plants, began to vanish. Skills once shared across generations were now confined to tiny circles, and the loss of a single elder could mean the permanent disappearance of essential survival wisdom. The networks that had allowed humans to adapt and thrive were broken, leaving individuals dependent solely on the memories and abilities of those around them. A misstep, a failed hunt, a misjudged weather pattern could no longer be remedied with counsel or assistance from distant relatives. Survival became intensely personal, every day a test of the limits of a single band. The psychological toll was immense. Loneliness pressed on the survivors as surely as hunger or cold. Without other humans nearby, the bonds that once reinforced social cohesion weakened. Children grew up with no contact beyond their immediate kin, and adults spent long stretches without conversation or reassurance. The quiet that dominated the world now seeped into the mind, creating a sense of being suspended in a vast emptiness, where every sound of wind or predator was amplified by the absence of other humans. The very act of survival became a constant negotiation with solitude. This fragmentation also reduced the chance of genetic diversity. Small, isolated populations were vulnerable not only to starvation and predation, but to the limits of inbreeding. Each birth carried the weight of genetic constraints, compounding the fragility of a species already teetering on the brink. The few remaining humans were trapped in pockets of existence where even the simplest interaction could determine the difference between life and death. Networks, trade, and shared knowledge, the foundations of adaptability, were gone. In their place was a world of confinement, where isolation became the new reality. Each group moved cautiously, rarely daring to risk travel for fear of losing what little they had, and the small fires that flickered across distant valleys were more reminders of separation than connection. Humanity survived, but only barely, held together by isolation, and by the fragile determination of those who refused to vanish entirely. At the edge of extinction, life became a precarious negotiation with fate. Each group of humans, already reduced to mere dozens in some regions, felt the fragility of existence as an ever-present weight. Children were born infrequently, and those who survived infancy were often weakened by hunger or disease. Every passing season seemed to erode the thin margins that allowed the species to persist. One failed hunt, one harsh winter, one misstep in gathering could erase an entire lineage, leaving only silence behind. In this harsh world, survival was never certain, and hope was measured in the faintest increments. Groups watched their numbers dwindle with a grim awareness. The loss of a single individual was more than a personal tragedy. It was a blow to the survival of the entire band. Each hunter, gatherer, or elder carried essential knowledge: where to find water during droughts, which plants could be eaten raw, how to track game across shifting landscapes. Losing one person could mean the loss of generations of accumulated wisdom. Communities became fragile chains of life, held together by the determination of a few, teetering on the brink of irrelevance. The environment offered no mercy. Predators roamed freely, exploiting the weakness of dwindling populations. Starvation stalked the survivors relentlessly, turning once reliable resources into uncertain gambles. Even a brief illness could decimate a group already weakened by scarcity. Bands moved cautiously, rarely venturing far from the shelter of caves or rock overhangs, for exposure to the elements or a surprise encounter with a predator could spell doom. Every breath, every step, was an exercise in vigilance, and yet vigilance offered no guarantee. Isolation compounded the peril. Bands could no longer rely on neighboring groups for help or trade. The loss of contact meant that skills, strategies, and alliances disappeared with each passing season. Humans had evolved to survive collectively, but now they were forced into microcosms of existence, where the failure of one was a threat to all. Small fires glowed against the night, each one a fragile bastion against the encroaching darkness, yet even these flickers could not ward off the uncertainty of the future. Generations were uncertain, fleeting. Elders worried not only for themselves but for the children who might never see adulthood. Women gave birth knowing that some infants might not survive to take their place in the dwindling circle. Men hunted with the knowledge that a missed kill could leave the group with nothing for days. Each season was an experiment in endurance, each day a brush with oblivion. Extinction was no longer an abstract concept. It was a shadow hovering over every action, every choice, every heartbeat. Humanity existed on a knife's edge, balanced between persistence and erasure, and the survivors clung to life with a desperate, relentless resolve. The survival of that tiny fraction of humanity is one of the most remarkable mysteries in our deep history. How, against staggering odds, did roughly 1,300 people endure when tens of thousands vanished? The question stretches across millennia, challenging our understanding of luck, adaptability, and the subtle forces of geography. Survival was never guaranteed, yet some lineages persisted, threading life through the eye of a needle that seemed impossibly small. Luck played a role that cannot be overstated. In a world collapsing under climate change, famine, and predation, mere chance could mean life or death. A band might stumble upon a hidden spring, an unspoiled valley, or a herd of game that others had missed. A sudden shift in the weather could favor one group and doom another. One miscalculation in hunting, one failure to find shelter, or one encounter with disease could wipe out an entire population. Those who survived often did so because of timing, chance encounters with abundance, and the sheer randomness of a world in flux. Adaptability was equally crucial. The humans who endured were not passive observers of their shrinking landscapes. They learned to exploit new resources, to hunt differently, to gather in ways their ancestors might never have imagined. Small changes in diet, in movement patterns, in the use of tools could mean the difference between starvation and sustenance. Bands that adapted quickly to the new, harsher environment were more likely to continue, while those rigidly tied to old patterns perished. Creativity and problem-solving, whether in tracking prey across frozen plains or finding hidden roots beneath the permafrost, became the lifeline of survival. Geography added another layer of protection. Some populations occupied refuges, isolated pockets of the earth where climate shifts were less severe, where water remained and plants persisted. Valleys sheltered from the ice, river systems that continued to flow, and coasts that offered fish and shellfish may have provided the rare stability needed to endure. Isolation, while socially costly, could also shield groups from disease, predation, or competition with other humans. The landscape itself, in its randomness, favored certain pockets of humanity. It was likely the combination of these forces, luck, adaptability, and geography, that allowed a mere 1% to survive. No single factor explains the endurance, and no human could have predicted the outcome. Each surviving band carried the delicate balance of these elements, a precarious inheritance that would shape the future of our species. In that sliver of humanity, the story of resilience was written, the foundation for all that would follow in our evolutionary journey. The fact that we exist today is a testament to the improbable endurance of those who navigated the darkness and emerged, however barely, into the light. Survival at the edge of extinction demanded more than sheer endurance. It required skill, ingenuity, and cooperation. The few humans who endured 900,000 years ago relied on a toolkit forged over hundreds of thousands of years, simple yet astonishingly effective in the right hands. Stone tools, fire, and the ability to hunt together were not luxuries, they were the thin line separating life from oblivion. Each advancement, each learned behavior, carried the weight of survival, and in those harsh landscapes, every advantage counted. Stone tools were the first and most essential instruments. Sharp flakes of flint, carefully struck from cores, allowed early humans to cut meat from bone, strip hides, and carve wood for shelter or spears. A stone handaxe could transform a scrawny antelope carcass into multiple meals, offering nourishment far beyond what bare hands could achieve. Tools extended the reach of human ability, turning weakness into strength. Each band depended on the knowledge of how to strike, shape, and maintain these stones, skills passed from one generation to the next. A poorly made tool could mean a wasted hunt, a missed opportunity, and ultimately, starvation. Fire was equally crucial, though less tangible in its power. Beyond warmth, fire extended hours of activity, warded off predators, and allowed for cooking. Cooked food was easier to digest, unlocking calories and nutrients that raw diets could not provide, strengthening bodies already pushed to the limits. Fires also became centers of social life, where strategies were planned, knowledge was shared, and young learners observed elders' techniques. Fire created a fragile bubble of safety in a hostile world, a temporary sanctuary that could mean the difference between life and death in freezing nights or predator-laden territories. Cooperative hunting further amplified these advantages. Small bands could coordinate attacks on larger prey, using strategy, communication, and patience to bring down animals far beyond the strength of a single hunter. The ability to work together, to anticipate movement, and to divide labor efficiently transformed hunting from a gamble into a calculated endeavor. Those groups that mastered teamwork were far more likely to survive than solitary individuals or bands that could not organize effectively. Sharing the kill, distributing calories, and pooling knowledge created resilience in numbers, yet the success of such cooperation required trust, timing, and the willingness to risk life for the collective. These tools and techniques did not guarantee survival, but they gave humanity a razor-thin edge. In a world of scarcity, where climate shifted unpredictably and predators roamed freely, mastery of stone, fire, and collaboration could turn a desperate struggle into a fleeting chance at life. Each flint edge, each spark, each coordinated hunt represented hope, the faint pulse of possibility. Humanity endured not because the world relented, but because it learned to bend the harsh realities of existence to its advantage. These skills were the scaffolding upon which the survival of the 1% rested, the delicate mechanisms by which life persisted when the majority had vanished. As the ice advanced and rainfall patterns shifted, the vast landscapes that had once supported tens of thousands of humans became increasingly inhospitable. Yet even in the most extreme periods, small havens persisted, microcosms of life where water ran, vegetation grew, and game animals could still be found. These pockets, later referred to by scientists as climate refugia, became lifelines for the species, places where humans clung to survival, while the surrounding world fell into near silence. In these isolated oases, the rhythm of daily life was still perilous, but the odds of survival were measurably higher than in the frozen plains or parched valleys beyond. Refugia were determined by geography and chance. Valleys shielded by mountains could trap warmer air, keeping rivers from freezing completely. Springs and shallow lakes supplied clean drinking water when streams elsewhere had dried. Coastal zones and river deltas often provided a more reliable array of food sources, from fish and shellfish to edible plants. Even small variations in soil quality, slope, or exposure to sunlight could create pockets of abundance. Humans who found themselves in such zones had a subtle but crucial advantage: access to resources that others could not reach. These safe havens allowed families to endure seasons that would have been fatal elsewhere. The clustering of survivors in refugia had profound social and biological consequences. Bands became more tightly knit, relying heavily on cooperation to exploit the limited resources. Knowledge of the land, tracking skills, and food preservation techniques became vital, and every mistake carried immediate consequences. These enclaves also concentrated genetic diversity in ways that would influence the future of the species. With isolated populations, the gene pool shrank, but the survivors passed on traits that enabled adaptation to extreme environments. In essence, the refugia acted as crucibles, testing human resilience and shaping the lineages that would endure. Life in a refugium was not easy, and isolation carried its own perils. Small populations were vulnerable to disease, predation, and accidents. One harsh winter or a sudden drought could wipe out an entire enclave, yet these pockets were the only places where humanity had a fighting chance. Firelight in these valleys and caves illuminated gatherings that planned hunts, shared food, and told stories of survival. Even in the bleakest epochs, these refugia provided the conditions necessary to sustain life long enough for future generations to carry the species forward. The story of human endurance, therefore, is inseparable from the geography of survival. Refugia were the last threads connecting humanity to the world, tiny havens where adaptation, skill, and cooperation could tip the balance between existence and extinction. Without these sanctuaries, the collapse that reduced humans to a few hundred individuals might have left no survivors at all. They were nature's fragile lifeboats, holding our species against the relentless storm of the mid-Pleistocene climate and allowing the improbable story of survival to continue. Survival during the harshest periods of human prehistory was never a simple contest of strength or endurance. The tiny bands that endured the mid-Pleistocene collapse learned quickly that brute force alone could not ensure life. In a world where resources were scarce, where predators prowled and seasons shifted unpredictably, the ability to cooperate, to share, and to care for one another became the most powerful tool of all. Groups that embraced these behaviors held a subtle advantage, one that could tip the fragile balance between survival and extinction. Cooperation manifested in countless ways. Hunting large animals required coordination, patience, and trust. One hunter might drive a herd toward others lying in wait, while another prepared to strike at the right moment. Success depended not only on skill but on timing, communication, and a shared understanding of the goal. Even the smallest mistakes could jeopardize the entire group, but those bands that worked together consistently brought back enough food to sustain their members through lean periods. The spoils of the hunt were rarely hoarded by a single individual. Sharing allowed everyone to benefit, ensuring that the weakest, the young, and the elderly survived alongside the strongest. Beyond hunting, cooperation extended to the protection and care of the vulnerable. Infants and children, who could not gather or hunt, depended entirely on the adults in their band. Elders carried the knowledge of seasons, edible plants, and predator behavior, and their survival was crucial for the continuity of that knowledge. Groups that ensured these members were fed and protected increased their overall resilience. Bands that neglected or abandoned the weak often suffered long-term consequences, losing crucial expertise or future generations that could have carried the group forward. Even in the daily tasks of gathering, shelter construction, and fire maintenance, coordination mattered. Sharing responsibilities allowed energy to be conserved, risks to be mitigated, and work to be completed more efficiently. Fire, for example, was not merely a source of warmth, it was a gathering point where planning, teaching, and strategy occurred. Groups that took advantage of collective effort could transform scarce resources into sustained survival, turning precarious existence into endurance. Cooperation also fostered social bonds, which were essential for long-term resilience. Trust and empathy created networks of support that encouraged risk-taking, learning, and adaptation. Individuals were more likely to survive when their efforts were supported and when their mistakes did not lead immediately to starvation or death. In essence, survival became a shared enterprise, and the smallest acts of care, sharing a portion of food, alerting others to danger, comforting a frightened child, were as vital as the sharpest spear or the keenest eye. The lesson is clear. Strength alone did not save humanity. It was the willingness to work together, to endure hardship as a collective, and to value each member of the band that allowed a handful of humans to persist when nearly all others perished. Cooperation became the lifeline that carried humanity through the darkness, laying the foundation for the social complexity that would define our species for hundreds of thousands of years to come. The genetic legacy of the near-extinction event 900,000 years ago still flows quietly within every human being alive today. Though we rarely pause to consider it, each strand of DNA carries the whisper of that ancient catastrophe, a record of survival that unfolded long before written history or even symbolic thought. Scientists call this phenomenon the genetic bottleneck, a constriction of the population so severe that nearly all genetic variation was lost, leaving only a narrow thread of life to carry the human story forward. It is a moment when chance and circumstance imprinted themselves onto the very essence of our species. Before the bottleneck, early humans and Neanderthals likely numbered in the tens of thousands, scattered across Africa, Europe, and parts of Asia. There was sufficient genetic diversity to allow for flexibility in the face of environmental changes, disease, and resource scarcity. Yet the mid-Pleistocene climate upheaval, coupled with shrinking habitable zones and dwindling food sources, caused populations to plummet to an estimated 1,000 to 1,300 individuals. These survivors were concentrated in isolated refugia, tiny pockets of relative abundance that became crucibles for the continuation of humanity. The genetic variation that remained was extraordinarily limited, a fact that would have consequences for millennia. This constriction meant that mutations, normally spread and shared across vast populations, were concentrated in a small number of individuals. Some alleles, different versions of a gene, vanished entirely, while others became dominant simply because they happened to exist in those few who survived. The result was a genetic uniformity unparalleled in other species of similar size. Today, humans possess far less diversity than chimpanzees, gorillas, or even certain species of whales, despite our global population numbering in the billions. Our genes bear the signature of a population that nearly vanished, a reminder that survival in those ancient eras often hinged on mere luck and location as much as adaptability. The bottleneck also had subtle but enduring effects on our health and evolution. With limited variation, certain genetic vulnerabilities were amplified, while others disappeared entirely. Traits that favored survival in harsh, small group conditions, resilience to starvation, the ability to metabolize a range of scarce foods, resistance to local pathogens may have become concentrated. In contrast, the loss of genetic diversity may have left us less adaptable to future challenges than we might have been with a larger, more varied population. Every human today carries these echoes of survival, a living record of a species pushed to the brink. Modern genetic studies reveal the stark reality of this bottleneck. By comparing the DNA of contemporary populations and using models of ancestral population sizes, scientists can trace back the point when variation shrank dramatically. Patterns in mitochondrial DNA, inherited from mothers, and Y chromosome DNA, passed from fathers, converge on this period as one of severe contraction. Even as populations recovered and spread across continents, the genetic imprint of that near collapse remained indelible. The bottleneck is more than a historical footnote. It is a lens through which we can understand the fragility and resilience of our species. Every human carries the legacy of a handful of ancestors who, against overwhelming odds, clung to life while nearly all others vanished. The narrow thread of DNA that survived was enough to rebuild a species, but it also reminds us how close humanity came to complete erasure. Our very biology is a testament to that perilous epoch, a permanent echo of a world where extinction almost prevailed. While the human population teetered on the edge of extinction in Africa, far to the north and east, other branches of the human family were carving out their own fragile existences. Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, along with Denisovans in Siberia and parts of Southeast Asia, were not simply passive observers of this catastrophe. They were active participants in the unfolding drama of survival. These populations, while separated geographically and genetically from the shrinking African populations, were themselves molded by the same harsh environmental pressures, their evolution intimately tied to the upheavals of the mid-Pleistocene. The Neanderthals, robust and muscular, adapted to the cold, ice-strewn landscapes of Europe. Their short, stocky bodies conserved heat, and their large nasal passages warmed and humidified the frigid air they breathed. Denisovans, known primarily through a handful of fossils and genetic evidence, inhabited high-altitude regions and harsh climates where human survival was marginal at best. Both groups developed technologies and social strategies designed to cope with scarcity, predation, and seasonal extremes, demonstrating that the challenges of survival were universal across the genus Homo, not limited to the ancestors of modern humans. Evidence suggests that the climatic pressures that caused the human bottleneck in Africa also shaped Neanderthal populations. Ice sheets advanced and retreated across Europe, altering forests and grasslands and forcing herds of game to migrate or vanish entirely. Neanderthals had to adapt quickly, developing tools for hunting large animals such as mammoths and reindeer, as well as strategies for storing meat and working collectively. Their survival required cooperation, knowledge of the land, and an intimate understanding of animal behavior, much like their African cousins who clung to the refugia. In some ways, Neanderthals were a mirror of human ingenuity, proving that even in marginal environments, intelligence and social cohesion could carve out a foothold for life. The crisis of survival also led to intriguing interactions between these human lineages. Genetic studies reveal that Neanderthals and Denisovans interbred with the ancestors of modern humans at multiple points. Small fragments of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA persist in the genomes of people today, particularly outside Africa, carrying with them adaptations that may have aided survival in new climates. Some of these genetic contributions influence immune response, skin pigmentation, and even metabolism, suggesting that the exchange of genes was a subtle form of collaboration, a way for humanity to inherit resilience forged in parallel evolutionary paths. Neanderthals and Denisovans thrived in their own refugia, facing extinction pressures similar to those that nearly erased humans in Africa. Their populations were never large, and survival required constant adaptation to environmental change. Yet, for tens of thousands of years, they managed to persist, proving that intelligence, culture, and tool-making were not unique to Homo sapiens. Their emergence underscores a broader lesson. The story of survival during the mid-Pleistocene was not a single narrative of one species enduring, but a complex tapestry of multiple human forms navigating the same deadly world. In this era of collapse and scarcity, the rise of Neanderthals and Denisovans highlights the diversity of human survival strategies. While modern humans clung to refugia in Africa, other human species found their own paths to endurance, shaped by geography, climate, and necessity. Their existence reminds us that the crisis of 900,000 years ago did not just narrow humanity to a few hundred survivors. It simultaneously fostered a remarkable experimentation in adaptation across the genus Homo, leaving traces that echo in our genes and in the fossil record, a silent testament to the tenacity of life in the face of near extinction. After the darkest chapters of the mid-Pleistocene, when humanity had been reduced to barely over 1,000 individuals, the survivors faced an uncertain future. The bottleneck had stripped away genetic diversity, leaving populations fragile and scattered. Each new generation carried the weight of survival, the consequence of living at the edge of extinction. Yet despite the overwhelming odds, life endured. Slowly, painstakingly, the remnants of humanity began to rebuild. A fragile rebirth that would lay the foundation for the species we recognize today. Recovery was measured in centuries, not decades. Bands of survivors in Africa, concentrated in small refugia, had to navigate a harsh landscape with limited resources. Food remained scarce, predators lurked, and the climate was unpredictable. Every child born was a precious asset. Every adult who survived a season, a vital contributor to the continuity of the group. Populations grew incrementally, their numbers rising only slightly with each generation, but the cumulative effect over hundreds of millennia was profound. The survivors' resilience, skill, and cooperation allowed them to slowly expand beyond the narrow refuges that had once contained them. As populations grew, early humans began to recolonize regions that had been abandoned or nearly uninhabitable during the bottleneck. Forests and grasslands, once devastated by climate shifts, recovered enough to sustain small game and edible plants. Water sources that had previously dried in some areas returned to life. The survivors, carrying knowledge of fire, hunting strategies, and tool-making, were able to exploit these recovering ecosystems more effectively than their ancestors. Each expansion was cautious. Every migration required careful observation of terrain, food availability, and seasonal patterns. Survival remained precarious, but the slow growth of populations allowed humanity to regain some of the resilience it had once possessed. This fragile rebirth was not uniform. Isolated groups developed independently, each facing distinct challenges that shaped their culture, behavior, and biology. In some regions, bands thrived, their knowledge accumulating over generations and leading to innovations in tool-making and social organization. In others, populations remained tenuous, teetering on the brink of local extinction. The uneven nature of this recovery meant that genetic diversity remained limited, a reflection of the bottleneck that had nearly erased humanity from the planet. The gradual recolonization also set the stage for the eventual migration out of Africa. Small, resourceful groups ventured into new territories, moving along rivers, coasts, and fertile valleys. These early explorers carried with them the essence of survival, the knowledge honed in refugia, and the social cohesion that had allowed them to endure when the majority of their species had vanished. As these populations spread into Eurasia and beyond, they began to encounter Neanderthals and Denisovans, other human lineages that had carved out their own tenuous existence during the same period. These encounters would eventually shape the genetic landscape of modern humans, leaving traces of interbreeding that persist today. The fragile rebirth of humanity was a slow, uncertain process, but it was relentless. Each generation added a layer of continuity, a small victory against the forces that had once threatened to erase the species entirely. Human voices, nearly silenced by the bottleneck, began to fill the valleys, forests, and plains once more. With every step, every hunt, and every child born, humanity reclaimed a foothold in a world that had seemed destined to forget it. This recovery was the prelude to the long, complex story of our species, a story defined not by certainty but by persistence, resilience, and the stubborn will to survive against unimaginable odds. Even today, nearly 1,000,000 years after humanity faced near extinction, the echoes of that perilous time remain hidden within our very cells. Every human carries in their DNA the faint traces of that ancient struggle, a genetic memory written into chromosomes long before the invention of language or art. These are the ghosts in the blood, subtle reminders that survival was never guaranteed, that our ancestors clung to life by the narrowest of margins, and that their victories and losses continue to ripple through our biology. The genetic bottleneck left its mark in ways that scientists can now detect through the careful study of modern genomes. Certain alleles, present in our distant ancestors, survived only because they existed in those who endured the mid-Pleistocene collapse. Other variations, once widespread across human populations, were lost entirely. This reduction in diversity left humans uniquely fragile compared to other species. While chimpanzees, gorillas, and other primates retain a broad spectrum of genetic variation, humanity carries a narrower toolkit of adaptations, a silent testament to how close we came to vanishing entirely. In some cases, this fragility is linked to our susceptibility to diseases, metabolic disorders, or other vulnerabilities that appear more often in humans than in many other mammals. The survival of a handful of humans also meant that genetic intermingling became inevitable. Isolated populations, cut off from each other, occasionally came into contact, sharing not only culture and knowledge, but also DNA. When Homo sapiens eventually encountered Neanderthals and Denisovans, these interactions were compounded by the residual effects of the bottleneck. Genes passed between species provided subtle advantages, such as improved immune responses to local pathogens or adaptations to high altitudes. The genetic legacy of these interbreeding events persists today, visible in the immune systems, skin pigmentation, and even susceptibility to certain diseases in modern populations. Humanity carries these gifts and burdens alike, proof that survival often requires a combination of luck, skill, and genetic exchange. Beyond interbreeding, traces of the bottleneck appear in the prevalence of inherited diseases. Certain genetic conditions that persist in human populations may be the direct result of the limited diversity left after the near extinction. Alleles that were once neutral or even advantageous in small, isolated populations can become harmful when populations expand. In this way, the survival of our species came at a cost. The narrow funnel of life that allowed a few individuals to persist also embedded vulnerabilities into the bloodlines of every future generation. These ghosts are not simply weaknesses, they are also reminders of resilience. They testify to the tenacity, adaptability, and cooperation of the small groups who survived in refugia, who learned to hunt, to share, and to protect one another under conditions that would have overwhelmed most species. Every cell, every chromosome, every faint echo of Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA carries a story of endurance, a record of how life can persist even when the odds are astronomically low. In essence, modern humans are walking archives of survival. We are not separate from the crises of the past, we are living embodiments of them. The DNA coursing through our veins tells a story of near extinction, adaptation, and improbable continuity. The ghosts in our blood remind us that humanity is both fragile and unyielding, shaped by peril, yet capable of enduring far beyond what any individual might imagine. Every heartbeat, every breath, carries a trace of that ancient struggle, a legacy of the human spirit preserved in the quiet, invisible record of our genes. It is difficult to grasp the magnitude of a world without humans. To imagine that 900,000 years ago our species might have disappeared entirely is to confront a silence so profound it defies comprehension. No firelight flickering against the walls of a cave, no sparks of ingenuity igniting the first tools, no voices calling across the plains to signal kin or warn of danger. The forests and savannas would have been untouched by our hands, rivers flowing without fear of dams or bridges, valleys empty of the footprints that would one day mark the spread of civilizations. In this alternate reality, the story of life would continue, but the peculiar thread of human influence, the thread that reshaped the planet, for better and worse, would be absent. Without humans, there would have been no language to carry ideas across generations, no symbols to encode thought, no ritual or myth to connect the living to the dead. The invention of fire, that transformative mastery of energy and warmth, would have remained unclaimed. Animals might have thrived differently. Some hunted less intensively, others not domesticated at all, yet the ecosystems themselves would lack the subtle alterations wrought by human intervention. Fields would remain wild, cities would never rise, and the soil itself would not bear the imprint of agriculture that has defined millennia. The world would continue, but without a species capable of imagining, shaping, or recording it. The absence of humans also means the absence of culture. Music, art, dance, literature, and the ability to reflect upon existence would have vanished before they were ever realized. The great monuments of stone, the intricate tools, the pottery and carvings that tell stories of those who came before, would have been impossible. History itself, the conscious recording and transmission of knowledge, would be nothing more than a dream that never stirred. Entire species that co-evolved with humans, dependent on domestication or symbiosis, might have faced different pressures, thriving or disappearing along separate paths. Predators and prey would follow patterns shaped purely by instinct, climate, and chance, without the extraordinary influence of human ingenuity to guide or disrupt them. Even the very concept of intelligence and self-awareness, at least as we understand it, would lack a benchmark. Our absence would leave a planet still dominated by survival and adaptation, but one missing: the peculiar leap that allows a species to manipulate the environment, to plan for the distant future, and to create societies capable of both compassion and cruelty on scales unimaginable to other animals. Every invention, from the wheel to the telescope, from language to the internet, would remain unimagined, the potential for reflection and transformation eternally dormant. To imagine this world is also to confront our own mortality in a deeper sense. Our survival was never inevitable. One mutation, one drought, one series of harsh winters could have wiped us from existence. That the tiniest fraction of humanity endured, carrying forward the knowledge, culture, and genetic lineage of our ancestors, is nothing short of miraculous. Without it, the Earth would have remained a beautiful, thriving planet, but devoid of the particular kind of awareness and creativity that defines the human experience. Silence would have reigned where stories, music, laughter, and ideas now flourish. No civilization, no philosophy, no art, no science would mark the passage of time. The world would be ancient, untamed, and unrecorded, forever missing the species that would one day look back and ask what might have been, and marvel at the improbable triumph of survival. Humanity's very existence is therefore a testament to fragility and resilience, a narrow thread on which the fate of the conscious, reflective world depends. To imagine its absence is to confront the profound weight of survival itself. The firelight flickers against the walls of the cave, its warmth a fragile defiance against the chill that seeps from the earth. Tiny sparks drift upward, disappearing into darkness, much like the generations that came before, those nameless ancestors whose survival hung by the thinnest of threads. Around the fire, small groups huddle together, bodies pressed for warmth, eyes alert for predators, minds alert for every sign of opportunity or threat. This is the world of the few, a precarious edge of existence where every life is precious, every heartbeat a testament to resilience. In the glow of that fire, one can imagine the countless choices that led to this moment, decisions made in desperation and hope alike. The careful selection of edible roots, the silent coordination of hunting parties, the instinctive sharing of warmth and knowledge, all of these actions, repeated over generations, became the scaffolding upon which our survival depended. These small acts of intelligence and empathy, carried out in the dark shadows of extinction, were more than survival strategies. They were the first sparks of what would become human ingenuity, the origins of culture, language, and cooperation that define our species today. The stars shine cold and distant above, indifferent witnesses to the long, fragile story of humanity. Beneath them, the survivors sleep fitfully, their dreams intertwined with the rhythms of the land, the movement of herds, the shifting of seasons. They do not yet understand that their endurance is not merely personal but monumental. They cannot know that the genes they carry, the lessons they pass to their children, will ripple through time, shaping the destiny of millions of humans yet to come. Every child born to this small group carries the weight of that ancient bottleneck, the survival of a species balanced on a knife edge, and the hope that life itself might continue. In these quiet, frozen moments there is a profound paradox. Humanity is both infinitesimal and monumental, fragile and astonishingly resilient. A mere 1,000 individuals, or fewer, were enough to seed the future. They were ordinary in every conceivable way, yet their endurance became extraordinary, a bridge across the yawning chasm of deep time. Their fires illuminated the darkness, their hands shaped tools, their minds solved the riddles of hunger and danger, and by doing so, they preserved the potential for all that would follow. As we look back across the expanse of 900,000 years, the echo of their survival resonates in every human heartbeat today. Our own existence, our voices, our thoughts, our creations, are the continuation of that slender thread, stretched through millennia. Every moment of modern life, every civilization, every work of art, every act of communication is built on the foundation of their endurance. Without their courage and adaptability, we would not be here. We would be nothing but a void in the long story of the earth. Now, in our own quiet moments, we lie beneath the stars and remember. The firelight may be long extinguished, the caves abandoned, yet the legacy remains. Humanity persists not by inevitability, but by chance, skill, and resilience. Every life that continues is a silent tribute to those who survived the unimaginable, who held fast in the cold and darkness, who ensured that the story of humans did not end but went on. Our existence is a fragile miracle, and as we close our eyes beneath the eternal sky, we sleep aware of the weight of that miracle, the depth of time we inherit, and the astonishing endurance that brought us here.